Hello, my friend. Here is Dostoyevski's view on existential courage. And it is a little bit different because Dostoyevsky, of course, was not a philosopher or a psychologist or a psychotherapist for that matter. He was a novelist and he predated the existentialist movement of the middle of the 20th century. For Dostoyevsky, human existence is an intense, terrifying, and deeply contradictory spiritual reality. And I mean contradictory, not paradoxical. To have existential courage takes stamina to look directly into what is essentially a fractured and irrational depth of the human psyche, which is what Dostoyevsky calls the underground. For Dostoyevsky, it is about going into that underground, being unafraid to meet what's hidden there, and to accept the weight of moral responsibility without losing your sense of soulfulness and your capacity to raise yourself to a higher level of spirit. So he explores what courage is in different books in different ways. In his book Notes from an Underground, Dostoyevsky's protagonist rebels against a reductionist view of humanity and argues that if you reduce human behavior to mathematical formulas, to the laws of nature, or just to self-interest, you strip away everything that makes a human being complex and creative and what makes us actually human. So for him, the act of courage is to intentionally face chaos, suffering, destruction, just to prove that you are an individual, not just a cog in a machine, not just, as he says, a piano key or an organ stop played upon by forces outside yourself. Existential courage is literally to have the bravery to face your own irrationality and still make sense of it. It is the refusal to conform to comforting yourself by just being part of a sterile system that promises you happiness, but that takes the price of your authenticity and of your self-determined freedom. Dostoyevsky goes on to explore this existential freedom and this courage to capture it, to encapsulate it, to live it. And he speaks about the burden of absolute freedom through the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov. There, Ivan Karamazov tells a parable where Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and the Grand Inquisitor arrests him, Jesus, and explains that the church has secretly aligned with the devil to correct Christ's mistake. And that mistake was to give humanity too much freedom of choice, which the Inquisitor argues is the source of pure agony for weak, wretched human beings. He explains that most people don't actually want this freedom. They want bread and certainty, he says. They want someone to take the burden of their conscience away and tell them how to live precisely, and then they'll do it. He says, I tell thee that man is tormented by no greater anxiety than to find someone quickly to whom he can hand over that gift of freedom with which the ill-fated creature is born. So, in this narrative, existential courage is defined as the stamina to bear the terrifying gift of moral freedom. The coward begs for an authority figure or an ideology or a dogma to relieve themselves of that responsibility, but the courageous person accepts the challenge and will live with the anxiety that inevitably follows, because that means we have to choose between good and evil every single day with no real certainty that you get it right and with no external guarantees of where this will lead you. That is what moral courage truly is for Dostoyevsky. And he goes on to show this in Crime and Punishment, because this is where he shows his protagonist Rodion Raskolnikov, who attempts to act out a kind of pro-Nietzschean theory, dividing humanity into ordinary people who must obey the laws and extraordinary people who have the right to overstep the moral law for a higher purpose. This has tones of the early Heidegger too. He then commits murder, as you probably know, to prove that he is an extraordinary man who can transcend guilt through sheer force of will. And Raskolnikov tries to pretend he has existential courage in doing this, but this courage curdles into something that leads to profound psychological, emotional, moral isolation and alienation and tremendous anxiety, which is described excruciatingly, like, the Heideggerian not being at home, of Unheimlichkeit. Dostoyevsky shows you that true existential courage is not about aggressively dominating reality or cutting yourself off from the human community or standing above it in some way. Dostoyevsky shows you that the real courage that Raskolnikov shows begins after his collapse, when he undergoes the process so painful of his repentance and opens himself up to love and accepts the responsibility he has to suffer alongside others. This is also visible in the brothers Karamazov, in the figure of Father Zosima, who speaks about the contrast between love as we dream about it, which is easy and sentimental and has immediate gratification, with what he calls active love. This is a love in action, in a harsh and dreadful way sometimes. It is something you have to learn, you have to practice. It is a labor and therefore leads to a fortitude. This, for Dostoyevsky, is the true architecture of courage. To have the long-term stamina, to remain vulnerable and open to the suffering of others. even when they show you ingratitude or hostility or abandonment, because we accept that each of us is guilty before all, for everyone and everything. Everything is interconnected, and therefore all we can do is to aim to live in as balanced, open and active a manner as we can manage. So for Dostoyevski, to sum it up, existential courage is no longer anything to do with being tidy or getting intellectual comfort, my friend. It is a stormy, internal wrestling match between faith and doubt, pride and humility, freedom and bondage. That is where you find your true existential courage.